Good afternoon. Today we're going to be picking up with lecture number 9. We're going to be talking about the Washington and Adams administrations and the new government that they formed. When we talk about the 2 presidential terms of George Washington and the 1 presidential term of John Adams, understand that we're talking about a period in American history known as the Federalist era. The Federalists, of course, are one of those sort of proto-political parties that develops during the founding period. The fledgling United States gained a second lease on life with the creation of the Constitution in 1787. As we learned last time, it followed roughly 11 years of inadequate government under the Articles of Confederation. The period we're going to begin with today is best characterized as a time of repeated clashes between the developing political parties, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. These 2 groups, we've said, contended over a variety of issues, but one of the most contentious was the need for a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists believed the Bill of Rights was essential to preserve individual rights and to guard against government tyranny. Remember, the Anti-Federalists are worried about one thing, worried about consolidation of power. They wanted to protect individual rights against that notion of the consolidation of power. By contrast, the Federalists, Washington and Adams, believed the Bill of Rights was unnecessary to limit federal power. And the reason they believed this is they had just created a document which explicitly laid out the powers of the federal government. The Federalists had difficulty seeing a future in which that federal government would overstep its bounds. We can look back in hindsight 230 years down the road and describe that belief as naive. But that was the belief at the time. The federal government would never seek to go beyond those express limits that had been put in the Constitution. When considering the different interpretations of the U.S. Constitution, I think it's important to point out the unique nature of this essential document. The U.S. Constitution is unique, and it's unique because it tells the government, rather than the people, what it's allowed to do. In other words, our Constitution limits the actions of government, not the people. In most of the rest of the world, government tells the citizens what they're allowed to do. Therefore, it's the action of the citizen that's limited in most systems. Because the limits of government are spelled out in what have become known as the enumerated powers of the Constitution, Federalists saw little need to further limit government through a Bill of Rights. They saw such a limitation as redundant. And this is going to be Alexander Hamilton's position. He is the arch Federalist, the high Federalist, and he's going to argue against a Bill of Rights. The Federalists believed government would never step beyond those powers enumerated in the Constitution. Let's take a little deeper look at the 2 parties that developed around this very important issue. Some of this is review from what we've said before, but I think it bears repeating. Anti-Federalists, leaders like Sam Adams, Richard Henry Lee, and Patrick Henry, these men were sympathetic, as we said, to what they called the spirit of '76, and by that they meant the original ideas of the Declaration of Independence. We said that they believed the Articles of Confederation laid out a good system, that it protected the sovereignty of the states against centralized power. We said that their greatest fear was consolidation of too much power in one institution or one individual. And we also said that they were very suspicious of the motives of those who had originally called for the Constitutional Convention. After his return from France, Thomas Jefferson quickly becomes the leader of this movement, or the leader of this group of thinkers. On the other side, we have Federalists like Washington and Hamilton, Franklin, and at least at this time, James Madison as well. Now, Madison is going to switch sides. in American history. He's going to leave the Federalist movement and join the anti-Federalist or the Republican movement as it later becomes known. These men, these Federalists, believed that the national government had to be strengthened at the expense of state sovereignty. They looked to broaden the power of the national government to tax and regulate commerce. They saw what they believed to be the huge economic potential of the young country. Because the anti-Federalists refused to participate in the convention, Federalist views largely won the day, and they characterize our Constitution. In addition to their disagreement over the need for the Bill of Rights, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists generally contended on the following issues. One of them is going to be Alexander Hamilton's economic plans for the nation. A second thing that they disagreed about was American foreign policy. The Federalists favored a close relationship with England, while the Anti-Federalists favored maintaining a close relationship with France. And then lastly, the two groups are going to contend over how powerful this new federal government should really be. So let's move from that to really the first presidency. There were presidents under the Articles of Confederation. We don't remember any of them because the executive was so weak. So really, we can call George Washington the first real president of the United States. Already a hero to the nation, Washington became the father of the country when he served 8 years as the chief executive. As there was no real example upon which to draw, President Washington and his cabinet had to lay out many of the practices and traditions that today we still associate with the presidency. Things like the State of the Union address. President Washington gave his first State of the Union in person. When he went into the chamber and met with Congress and gave his address orally, apparently he felt he wasn't shown the respect that the office deserved, and he refused to give any of his future States of the Union in person. He gave the remaining 7 in writing. Something else that Washington and his cabinet had to invent was the title that we use for the executive officer. It was, in the end, Washington who chose the title president. His vice president, John Adams, had a whole slew of titles, each of them more exalted than the former. Washington wasn't having any of that. He wanted just a simple title. He wanted to be called President or Mr. President. The notion of a term limit is set by George Washington. It doesn't become formally part of the Constitution until 1947, when the 22nd Amendment is added. Up until the presidencies of Franklin Roosevelt, no one dared go beyond 2 terms. That was what Washington set as the limit, and that tradition lasted until 1947. The notion of a farewell address is something that Washington invented as well. Washington's farewell address is very well known. He wrote it with the help of Alexander Hamilton. It is a fairly lengthy farewell address. It appeared in a number of installments in the nation's papers. Now, presidents don't typically do a written farewell address. They do something televised as they're leaving office. And then finally, the last tradition that we associate with this first presidency is the notion of a cabinet. Washington's creation of the cabinet itself was extra-constitutional, but President Washington reasoned that he was within his rights to add these advisors to his staff. Washington's cabinet was very small. It had just 3 positions. The Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, of course, was dedicated to the idea of small government. Jefferson is going to oppose Washington. He's going to oppose other members of the Washington administration on the size and power of the federal government. But he serves as the first Secretary of State. The first Secretary of the Treasury was, of course, Alexander Hamilton. So we have Thomas Jefferson, the arch anti-federalist, and Alexander Hamilton, the arch federalist, serving side by side in the first cabinet. Hamilton supported a more muscular, active federal government. The third member of this small cabinet is the Secretary of War, and that's Henry Knox. You remember Henry Knox was the Boston bookseller that taught himself military tactics. He got those 59 cannon from Fort Ticonderoga 300 miles back to Boston at that key moment early in the Revolutionary War. So it's a very small cabinet. But again, the Washington administration is literally making these things up as they go along, things that we now see as long-standing traditions associated with the presidency. One of the most important acts of Congress during President Washington's first term was the creation of the federal court system, and this was done through the Judiciary Act of 1789. The act provided for the appointment of a Chief Justice as well as 5 associate justices. The first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is John Jay. It also created, did the Judiciary Act, the federal districts and the circuit courts. Remember, at this time, judges literally rode the circuit, right? They rode around hearing cases in very, very large areas. They would ride their horse throughout the district, hearing those cases as they traveled. John Jay, who we just mentioned, had been one of the writers of the Federalist Papers, along with James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. One of the big issues that President Washington is going to have to face is trying to put this young nation on a firm financial footing. And he tasks Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of the Treasury, with that. And what Hamilton produces are what are known as his economic reports. That's where I want to focus our attention now. Written as Secretary of the Treasury under Washington, Hamilton's reports to Congress laid out the financial problems facing the nation. And there are 3 of these reports. The first is the report on public credit. In this report, Hamilton dealt with the nation's debt problem. As a solution, Hamilton proposed the national government assume the debt of the individual states. The federal government take on the debt of the individual states. Assumption was not popular with states like Virginia, which had worked very hard to pay off its war debt. Hamilton sought to fund this debt by issuing new national bonds. Also unpopular, as this would make the debt permanent, and that scared a lot of folks. Hamilton believed permanent debt would tie the wealthy to the new national government because they would have to support that government if they expected to get paid on their investment. Very, very smart move by Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton wasn't terribly concerned about the new federal government assuming this large debt because he had a plan to pay it down. Hamilton intended to pay down the debt through a combination of tariffs and excise taxes. In 1789, Congress imposed the first tariffs on foreign goods. They were set at 8%. We would consider those fairly high today. Hamilton sought to raise additional revenue for the federal government in 1791 when he sought and won an excise tax on certain domestic items, namely whiskey. Excise taxes are always unpopular with those whose industry has been targeted. And out of this excise tax on whiskey, we get the Whiskey Rebellion, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Hamilton's second report to Congress was called the Report on a National Bank. In this report, Hamilton advocated for the creation of a national bank modeled on the Bank of England. The idea was to provide easy credit for the growing economy. The bank could control the currency and thus assure its value. The creation of the Bank of the United States was opposed by anti-federalists, opposed especially by Thomas Jefferson. The other group opposed to the creation of a national bank were the state banks that were popping up throughout the colonies. The third report that Hamilton wrote was called the Report on Manufactures. In this report, Hamilton laid out his plan designed to spur an industrial revolution. in America. But this plan largely failed because it implemented protective tariffs and federal subsidies. I'm not going to get into the economics of it, but I think history has shown us that protective tariffs limit competition, and as a result, we get neither good products nor a lot of products. Protective tariffs tend to work against production, no matter how they're intended. And federal subsidies do the same. But this was Hamilton's plan. It was implemented for a few years, but most historians say that the report on manufacturers was a failure. We'll pick up there with the next lecture. Thanks.